I think threshold training is one of the most misunderstood concepts in endurance sports and fitness in general. It's not necessarily a specific heart rate or pace or magic 4 millimolar lactate number. Threshold is a physiological tipping point, a point of no return, maybe. And in this video, I will break down what your threshold actually is from a physiological perspective, using sophisticated methods like lactate, but also muscle oxygen measurement using NIRS. But not only that, I will also provide you some simple tips on how you can find your own threshold without using all that fancy equipment. And then I will show you what the training science actually says. How does threshold training compare to other training methods to improve VO2 max or sustainable power? And then I will obviously show you how you can apply it to your own training to improve your performance in both endurance sports, but also with a little hint to functional sports like HYROX and CrossFit. Spoiler, you don't always have to collapse dying on the floor to get a good training stimulus. All right, excited for this one? Let's go straight into it. Hi everyone, welcome back to another wod-science video. My name is Gomar. I'm a senior scientist at ETH Zurich based in Switzerland. And for the last decade or so, I studied and taught different aspects of exercise physiology, and my goal now is to bring some of that science that I learned back to you guys. All right, the big debate. What is actually your physiological threshold? Scientists have been debating this for a long time, also throwing out different definitions of your threshold. So to set things straight in the beginning of this video, I will explain you my definition, what I think is the most accurate to explain or define your threshold. In my opinion, it is the highest intensity that an athlete can sustain where lactate production from glycolysis and lactate clearance, mostly from the muscles, is in balance. So think about it, you are hopping on a bike or doing a run, and you are exactly at your threshold. That means that your lactate will increase, as you see here in the blue line, and kind of constantly stays at the same pace. It is a manageable intensity where lactate stays below a certain threshold, doesn't go above as the red line, or below when you're doing, for example, zone 1 or zone 2 training, where likely the lactate even would decrease. So that is what we call your maximal lactate steady state, MLSS. And I think this concept of maximal lactate steady state is the best visualized using this graph. By the way, I changed the layout of my graphs. Put in the comments if you like this style better than before, or if you don't like it, please roast me in the comments. It's very useful for me to learn from you. So very simply, let's take an example. You go from walking to slow jogging to fast running to sprinting. Obviously, for all those activities, you need more and more incremental energy, and that energy comes from chemical energy, that is your food, that is converted into mechanical energy via ATP, the energy currency of the body. I've talked about this a lot in previous videos. All right, and that energy is predominantly coming from aerobic sources, as you can see here in the light blue, during long or slow activities, for example walking and slow jogging. But interestingly, there's always some background glycolysis anaerobic energy that is working. All right, and then your threshold is kind of this tipping point where there is a large amount of aerobic energy production, but also the amount of glycolysis or the ATP that is produced from glycolysis, and hence the lactate production, are in balance. And then when you tip over that point, for example, you do a really hard sled push in the beginning of a HYROX, you tip over that point, you need more energy from glycolysis, there's going to be more byproducts, and you will fatigue because you cannot sustain that long of a glycolytic activation, so to speak. All right, so your steady state means that you're on the tipping point between high aerobic energy production and the glycolysis that is working, but you can still clear all the lactate, all the byproducts are coming from the red part from the glycolysis in this point. So that is systemically, so to speak, what your threshold is. But then, as you know, on this channel, we try always to be quite critical and to look deeper into some of the science that have been published. You can also look at it from a local point of view, right? Within or in the muscle. And then we have to look, or we have to use this little device. I mean, this is from train.red, but you also have Moxie or other companies. And we have now the ability to assess oxygen that is sitting in the muscle during exercise or during rest, or your relative oxygen. So for me, a threshold, and also for other people, obviously, a threshold can also be explained by when there is, again, this fine balance between oxygen delivery from the heart and from the red blood cells that is coming into the capillaries and into the muscle cell, and the usage of oxygen, for example, when you start contracting, when you start running. When that fine balance is reached, that could also be looked at your threshold. I will give you some explanations to explain this a little bit better later. Cool, so that is how you can visualize or theorize your threshold. But that's very nice. I mean, some theory, some textbook knowledge, but how can you detect it? How can I do something with that information? And then I try to visualize this with a triangle. The base would be detecting your true physiology, right? Your true tipping point, lactate or muscle oxygen. And then you can go up. That is less accurate and less also complicated, as you can see here from the arrows, that are derivatives. Derivatives that use, for example, heart rate or FTP power that estimate your threshold, right? So it's not accurate. It's accurate, but it's not your true physiology. It is a derivative of your true physiology. And then you also have the top of the pyramid, which is not very complicated and also less accurate, but very easy to do. That would be your feeling, your rating of perceived exertion. Let's go through the pyramid and explain you how you can use it and how you can do it for your own training. So first of all, lactate. I mean, I've talked about this quite a lot already. You might have seen this also in other courses. For that, you need to do a simple test, but you also need lactate measurements. And that's a little bit the complicated part of this. So for example, you do a ramp test to exhaustion in the lab or even in your own gym if you know how to do, if you know how to take lactate. And you always increase the speed or the watts, the power through time, right? And then you see in the beginning, as I explained in the beginning of the video, you have the predominantly aerobic energy production for low speeds, low intensity, because your aerobic system can produce sufficient amount of ATP, and then the ATP demand is exceeded, so your glycolysis kicks in higher gear, and your lactate production will increase, your fast glycolysis, all right? And then you see that the lactate goes up, and the most exponential point of your curve, that will be your threshold power or your threshold speed. In this little example, it would be around 14.8 kilometers an hour for that athlete. And that is interesting to know because, for example, what I did not so long ago, I tested an Elite 15 HYROX racer. And we did basically the same test. And you see here in orange, that would be its lactate curve. And you see beautifully that he has a very long or very low baseline lactate. That means that he has a very well-developed aerobic energy system, way better than, for example, hybrid athletes like CrossFit athletes, which is way more strength biased. That's on the side. And then it steeply goes up, and that would be, measuring your or his threshold power, which is in this case around 3.5 millimolars of lactate and 17 to 17.5 kilometers an hour threshold speed. So that's fast speed, obviously, right? And then I asked him, okay, what is the time that you usually do on a HYROX? Like, I'm meaning not the time, the times for running, the speeds for running. And then he said exactly 3.5 minutes, so 3.5 to 3 minutes 40, which is exactly at his threshold speed, 17.5 kilometers an hour. So this is a great test, in my opinion, to do for HYROX athletes to know, okay, what will be their threshold speed and what will be also their race speed when it comes to a race, given they are obviously well equipped in also doing the functional stations, but that's on the side. And then that's one, so that's a running test, for example, a HYROXer or a 1,500 meter runner or a triathlete, very good tests to understand your threshold. But let's also talk about, we also like to talk about CrossFit on this channel. CrossFitters, yes, you can put them on a bike test or you can let them do a run test, but it's not very sport specific. So we found out, or we developed an thrusters and burpee test, which is the same principle. You increase your burpees, you increase your thrusters through time in intervals of 4 minutes with 1 minute rest. And then we measure lactate through time, through all those intervals. And you see here, this is the lactate curve, almost the same as you saw before, of a CrossFit Games champion, so very high level athlete. And also here, we could find his specific threshold using the WOD-motions sensor to also understand the power he's producing at those functional movements, because obviously that's a key variable. So also for him, we could find his threshold, and then we can also design some workouts around that. I will get to that later in the video. So that is something that is already really well established from before. Your systemic threshold is measured by lactate, all right? But then, as I said, you can also use this little device, and it's a NIRS device, or a near infrared spectroscopy device. And when I did my PhD 15 years ago, this thing costed 15,000 or 20,000 euros. Now it's cheaply available for 700 euros, I think, if I'm correct. So that's pretty cool. And also you can just put it in a wearable and just strap it on different parts of your body, biceps, vastus lateralis, calf, and so on. And what you see here is the graph, the muscle oxygen, the relative muscle oxygen. So ranging from 20% to 70% in the muscle. During such a test on a bike, in again a games athlete, all right? So an incremental speed test or bike test to exhaustion. And here you also can find different breaking points in your muscle oxygen, because at some point your oxygen utilization, the amount of oxygen that is used by your muscle, is outpaced by the amount of oxygen that is provided to the muscle. And that will also be very closely related to your physiological threshold, right? So it's not really systemic threshold, it's rather local threshold. So you can draw some lines where you see these breaking points, and then you beautifully see on the right side when it turns from yellowish to red, so when it really starts to steepening down. Really well done, by the way, from train.red to visualize this. And then you can find your threshold. What is pretty cool by train.red, I just checked their app. They have this built into their app. So meaning that you can just strap on this little device, do your test that is already pre-made in their app, and then it provides you automatically your local threshold using their algorithms. So I think it's quite useful for athletes that don't have access to lactate and also don't want to take lactate. I think that's something you can think about having for your athletes if you're really into this stuff. Great. And then a last point to nail down this difference between systemic threshold and your local threshold is what you see here is the muscle oxygen of a person that wants to do high volume of rowing training, because he wants to cross the Atlantic. Yeah, that's for another video. But what you see here is a difference between different body parts, and I think very useful and interesting for functional sport. The top one in yellow is his vastus lateralis, so his thigh muscle. All right, again, during a road test to exhaustion. And the red one, or the bottom line, is his bicep. And you can see here that his biceps goes down in muscle oxygen, or deoxygenates, way faster than, for example, his thigh. So this you can never pick up with basic lactate testing. Therefore, you need local measurements. So this caused us to change his technique. He's probably pulling too hard with his biceps and not using his legs enough. That would improve his overall performance, all right? Again, you cannot measure this with lactate. So pros and cons of using both devices, in my opinion. Cool. Next one, derivatives. And those are the things that I think cause a lot of confusion in people. There's a lot of ways to kind of try to find this threshold without using these complicated methods as I just explained. And one of them is FTP, or functional threshold power. It's a difficult word for simply your average power over 20 minutes all out on the bike. All right. So back in the day, scientists have found, okay, we cannot always test anyone or everyone with lactate, so we have to find some kind of a practical test. So what did they do? There's various protocols. Please don't roast me in the comments. There's many ways of doing this, but basically what you do a very hard warm-up. So not just a simple warm-up like a walk in the park. No, you try to pre-fatigue yourself. You rest 2 minutes, and then you do a 20-minute all-out test on the bike or on the row erg, something continuous, and then you take 95% of that average power. So for me, that would be I think I can hold around 260 watts for 20 minutes on average, and then 95%, that would be very close to this maximal lactate steady state or my threshold power. But obviously, this is just a random number, kind of, right? This 95%. For CrossFitters, this likely will be 90% because they're more anaerobically equipped. For cyclists, this will be maybe 99%. Okay, so it's a ballpark number, but it's not perfect, so to speak. But that number you can obviously use to do your intervals on, as I explained, I think 2 or 3 videos ago, the ultimate guide to interval training, where you use a percentage of your FTP to guide your threshold training, to guide your zone 2 training, or to guide even your HIIT training or your sprint interval training. Go check out that video if you are interested in a deeper dive on interval training per se. So that's FTP power. Pretty straightforward. You take around 95% of that power, and that will be very close to your threshold. But then you also have heart rate, and that is what most, for example, Garmin or even I think Whoop or other smartwatches use. They use 88 to 93% of your maximal heart rate. Again, that is based on algorithms, it's based on big data. It's not individual, so it's not perfect. It's not that accurate in my opinion. Using that to also estimate your threshold, let's say heart rate or even race pace. For me, this is again 195 approximately is my maximal heart rate. Getting older, so maybe 192, and then 88% of that would be close to my threshold power. And for me, actually, this is kind of correct depending on the situation and the workout I do. And then the last one that is maybe very practical, certainly for functional sports, in my opinion, where the movements are not always that continuous, actually are never that continuous, and that is simply rating of perceived exertion. And you've heard about that. That is simply a scale from 1 to 10, and where the threshold, let's say, power or the threshold speed will be close to 6 to 7 out of 10. So it is hard to somewhat hard. It feels annoying. And then maybe one little tip that I can give you, certainly in the functional fitness space, it's very hard to actually estimate this. When you ask these people, some people say 10 when they're not even suffering that much. And some people say, oh, this is easy. This is 2 out of 10, but they're actually sweating like crazy and dying on the floor, but it's still a 2 out of 10. So what you can do is the test, the burpees and the thruster test that is in the description. So just go ahead and look at that test a little bit deeper and write your RPE, so your rating of perceived exertion, after every interval. So it should obviously increase, and then you really know, okay, what is my maximal exertion, 10 out of 10, what is kind of in between, 6 to 7, and what is super easy, which would be the warm-up, right? Because people, certainly in CrossFit and also in HYROX, have been training so hard all the time, they don't really gauge really well what their rating of perceived exertion is. That's a little bit of what I always found when we're testing athletes. So rating of perceived exertion is something we use all the time in our training plans, because what we think, and I will explain this later on, many of the training plans, certainly in functional fitness, are always at a similar intensity, all right? Hard, somewhat hard to very hard, and with different modalities using AMRAPs and 4-time workout. But what we want to do is to vary in the intensity way more than what is usually seen in training programs. We have different programs. One of them is for HYROX, for people coming from a strength background, for example, CrossFit background, who want to excel or do better, at least in HYROX. And then also people who are coming from the opposite end of the spectrum, are coming from the endurance world and want to also try HYROX. So these I would definitely recommend to check out the 7-day trials to understand how we use progressive overload using these different intensities of workouts to get you to your next goal. And then on the other hand, we also have functional fitness or CrossFit specific training plans for people who really want to get to the next level, the compete program. Or on the other hand, based on all the data we have gathered from our hybrid experiments, from our previous experiments that we have done with all the community members on the channel, we also have the hybrid season, where strength and weightlifting bias days are alternated with skill and metcons or endurance days. And we found that this is actually a very good way of training, certainly when you are training mostly alone or with a couple of friends, not an affiliate, and you want to be super efficient in your training. I think that hybrid season, it's a little bit less volume, but very efficient way of training. If you want to check it out, go to the first link in the description or scan the QR code that is popping up right now. You will get fit in a structured way, and you definitely also help the channel, help me put all the time in this video. Highly, highly appreciated from my side. So very nice, Gomar. You have explained me all this science on threshold training, but the question remains, why should I train threshold? Why is this important? And then we have to go back into the time with the story of Jakob Ingebrigtsen. Maybe you have heard about them. He is a young Norwegian middle distance runner. There was a paper published in 2019 about how he got to the top, how he managed his training schedule. I will definitely put that paper in the link in the description. I think it's a very good read for practical coaches, not only in the endurance world, but also in HYROX and CrossFit world to give you some perspective. And basically, he trained like most middle distance runners, ran a high volume, 140 to 160 kilometers per week, which is insane, by the way. But there was one little detail that got many people's attention, and that was that he was monitoring his threshold training with lactate. So he was doing his threshold stuff at exact speeds of that day, so not just calculated speed or whatever, of that day, because every session he measured lactate to see he was not exceeding his threshold, because he knew, and that's also a very important point, that when you are exceeding as a distance runner or an endurance athlete, and exceeding your threshold power, then the fatigue will kick in very quick and you won't be able to recover from that session very well. Think about also the connection with CrossFit and high intensity sports here for sure. So that's perfect. Then we just only do threshold training to get better at whatever endurance events or even whatever HYROX events. Why not? Because you are pushing your endurance, like your VO2 max, or your, not VO2 max, your aerobic capacity to the max, but you still don't have that much fatigue building up, and you will be able to recover pretty well from those sessions. And that's exactly what this very well done study has done already some time ago, where they had 48 cyclists, triathletes, and runners, all with a VO2 max above 62 milliliter oxygen per kilogram body weight per minute. So that's a very high VO2 max early for a study. So that well-trained endurance athletes, and they went through 9 weeks of training. They had different groups of athletes. One group did polarized training, low intensity training, and high intensity training, and little threshold training. All right, so low intensity, high intensity, little threshold. The other one did HIIT, that was always high intensity work, no low intensity stuff. Then the other did threshold training, exactly as I just explained, always at this annoying pace, but not going exceeding above their threshold. And then there was a last group that did high volume training, and that basically is always super low intensity, high volume of training. Good. And then they looked at what is the increase in VO2 max and also other parameters, but I will just explain VO2 max here, of these athletes if they did that training for 9 weeks in different groups. And to my surprise, and it was quite interesting in my opinion, that the polarized training, where they did high intensity work and low intensity work basically together, yielded by far the best results related to VO2 max, a 10% increase in VO2 max. Then you had HIIT, which is also like kind of the best of both worlds, a nice 5% increase. But then look at threshold training, there was a decrease in VO2 max. So this says that threshold training can be a valuable option to do in your training, but it doesn't mean that you always have to do threshold training. And why do I pull up this study? Because I think that many of the functional athletes or people in the CrossFit, also in the HYROX space, are making this exact mistake. They're doing, for example, 5 times per week, a 4-time workout or an AMRAP in their local affiliate. I was also one of those people 5 years ago. So they go into the gym, they do some strength, they get stronger for sure, but then they do their typical whatever 8 to 20 minute AMRAP or 4-time workout. And how does it look? You start off pretty hot, and then you settle into a pace that is close to your threshold, and then you push the last round where lactate goes up like crazy. So you are trying to also get the most amount of reps. So you're kind of doing some kind of a threshold training, but then also pushing even above that threshold, just kind of as a race or as a 5K run. So in my opinion, that is potentially harming your long-term development, because as we saw from that last study and also other studies, it's not necessarily the best way to improve your cardiovascular capacity. Therefore, you also need some zone 2 sessions and maybe some higher intensity sessions, even higher intensity than your typical 15-minute AMRAP, right? So that is food for thought, I would say. That doesn't mean that you cannot add those AMRAPs or threshold training or other types of training into your schedule, but I just think, as I alluded already to when I talked about our training programs, that you have to play with the intensity much more when it comes to functional sports, and also to other sports, by the way, because that's what the endurance athletes do. Yes, they do a lot of zone 2 work, but they also add some very high intensity work to their training schedule. This is well documented. So for example, what you can do this example is more for CrossFit. You do your Monday, you do sprints. All right. Then you do your 15-minute AMRAP, because obviously you need to train sport specific. Then you have a rest day. Then you do your threshold work. I will get to that, how you can do, for example, threshold work that is different from an all-out AMRAP. Then you do your 5 rounds for time, whatever workout you can put in there with functional movements. Then you do on Saturday, you have a rest day. And then on Sunday, you have your zone 2. So you have different intensities throughout the week, so that allows you to progressively overload, but not always kill yourself, and actually also train strength as well as skills, which are very important. Movement efficiency is extremely important in CrossFit. So how you can apply this, let's say you want to dig a little bit deeper into this whole threshold paradigm, and you want to use all the benefits of threshold. For example, you're a HYROX athlete or someone who's trying to train quite a lot and getting towards the next level, you do a double threshold, right? A double threshold is basically, in the morning you do a run or an erg, 4 times 7 minutes at your specific threshold pace that you found using sophisticated methods or derivatives, all right? And then in the afternoon, after some rest, you should be able to do, I call this a functional threshold workout. For example, a 40-minute EMOM of a 20-minute sled push, 15 pull-ups, 17 wall balls, 15 meter sled push, and then rest. And the goal is to hold a sustainable pace at RPE 7. For most people, this is lower than what they would train normally. Very important consideration, so to speak. Cool. I said a lot, so let's summarize most of the important points of this video. So thresholds, it's not a single number. It's a physiological tipping point, and that you can assess via sophisticated methods, like being very accurate, at least on that day of the test day, using lactate and also our friend train.red or nurse. But you can also use derivatives like your FTP, your heart rate, or your RPE, which is more of a feeling. Your threshold, why is it useful? Because you're pushing your system at a very high aerobic pace. So your adaptations will be very aerobic, certainly when you do running and more erg work. But because you're not over that tipping point, your fatigue will not be very high, right? It will be manageable, and you can come back the next day or maybe after a small rest day and train again, which is very useful for most people. Only doing thresholds, which is actually done by a lot of people, I think, in the functional space, is probably detrimental, because you need this difference in intensity that is pretty well established in most sports science literature. And as I already mentioned before, the most longer AMRAPs or functional workouts that are programmed in affiliates, in HYROX pieces, for example, are usually too intense. They're above your threshold, or maybe at your threshold in the last couple of minutes, way above your threshold. And maybe that is not perfect or not ideal, because yeah, the fatigue that builds up from those sessions will be very high, and you will get burned out pretty quick if you do that in too high volumes. If you train 2 times per week, it probably doesn't matter, right? You have enough time to recover. But if you want to have a sustainable training program, I think this is something to consider, and therefore use them wisely to stay in that threshold zone. Cool. That was it from my part today. I hope you found some value into this video. If you did, please go ahead and like and also subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot, and it helps to spread this message to more people. Thank you for that. If you're interested in learning more on the science, on fitness, functional fitness, nutrition, and all that good stuff that we always talk about, please click the video that is recommended by Mr. YouTube itself. Thank you for that, and see you in the next one.